Okay, and where can I see the commentary? I think it's probably broadcasting now. Can you see me? Wonderful. Just give me 2 seconds. So the live chat is in a different link, yeah? I'm just going back to the live chat. You sent me a link, did you not, in the initially? Yeah, please. Super. Okay. Thanks very much. Cheers. Okay, can everyone hear me? Can someone put me into live chat? Sorry for the technical difficulty we've had so far. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Doug. I hope you can all hear this. If you're having trouble hearing or you'd like to ask a question, if you just type something into the to the live chat on the screen, and I'll deal with it there. With very many apologies for the rather extreme delay, which is entirely my fault and occasioned by my lack of technical proficiency. We'll kick off with the lesson now. Those of you who have seen the advert for this will know that the lesson that we're planning to give today is called 8 Simple Ways to Break the Consequentialist Bubble. Now, what I'm going to do throughout the course of this lesson is to use this extremely high-tech visual aid, which will be backwards, I think, certainly from my perspective, in which I'm going to try and set out 8 different ways in which I think that debaters can move past or outside a consequentialist paradigm when they're debating. Now, you'll have seen from the handy visual aid I just showed a moment ago that there are two columns, 1 through 4 on the left-hand side and 5 through 8 on the right-hand side. Very high-tech visual aid here. The 8 boxes that I'll be filling in throughout the course of the evening will each contain 8 different strategies or tactics for breaking the consequentialist bubble, as I call it. And I'll be filling them in with a high-tech stapler and different bits of paper as we go. For those of you who have been so deficient in your plans for the evening that you had nothing to do except to stay around and watch me wrestle unsuccessfully with information technology in an attempt to broadcast this very late, and who are still actually watching this live, please do pop in your comments in the comments section, which I will be able to read, I think. And when you do so, as we go through the 8 different ways that I've set out, I'll try and field questions at the end of each of the ways, if there are those of you asking for questions and comments. So, that having been said, I'm going to go through the 8 different ways. Before I do, a couple of different caveats. The first of which is that I am not trained in philosophy. If you were to take the 8 strategies and tools that I'm about to give you and to deploy them on an academic essay, or if you were to take the way in which I use vocabulary or syntax as definitive and proper and academically correct, that probably would be a very foolish thing to do. I don't know what I'm talking about philosophically speaking. Safe to say, and as a result, when I've debated about sort of ethical issues before, I've had to work it out for myself and to learn by doing. And it's that I hope to impart this evening in this particular lesson, is 8 sort of tactics and strategies that I've used to escape from the consequentialist bubble in which most debates exist. Having said that, the second caveat I'd issue, of course, is that I haven't been in the debating community for some time as a competitor. So it may be that some of the stuff I'm about to say is dated, maybe that some of it will be timeless. I don't know, that will be entirely up to you to determine. Without any further ado, the last caveat I'm going to give is that you'll have seen the two columns. Those on the left-hand side are not actually ways of breaking the utilitarian bubble, or the consequentialist bubble, I should say. Those on the right-hand side are ways of doing so, at least to some extent. I'll explain what I mean when I go along. The ones on the left are fake ways. They're not really ways in which you can challenge utilitarianism or consequentialism. They're ways in which you can live within it. Before we begin, a bit about definitions. The consequentialism is essentially a method of thinking about ethical questions, which, as far as I understand it, says that you measure the goodness and the ethical rightness of an action by its likely consequence. Utilitarianism is a subspecies of consequentialism, which says that the manner in which the consequences that you wish to affect and the manner in which you weigh those consequences is to look at the maximizing of happiness and the minimization of pain for the greatest number of people. And then if you're able to do that, then you will be able to judge the ethical rightness or wrongness of an action. The right actions are the ones that promote the greatest amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain. Wrong actions do the converse. So in reality, rather than saying the consequentialist bubble, I probably should say the utilitarian bubble, because a number of the claims I'm going to make, even on the right-hand side of the ledger, are utilitarian ones. So to that extent, there's something of a misnomer in the title, because a number of the claims I'm going to make might be consequentialist claims, but not necessarily utilitarian claims. Without further ado, what are the 8 strategies? Well, the first of which, and this is going to be my high-tech visual aid coming into good use here. The first strategy for breaking the utilitarian bubble is don't break the utilitarian bubble at all. The reason I say that, I don't know if this is coming up backwards for those who are watching at home, the reason I say that is that it will oftentimes, and in fact most times, be entirely unnecessary. In the 700 or so times I've participated in a competitive debate in my time, I would say that on no more than 10 or 12 of those times have I expressly stated that I'm making a non-utilitarian argument, an argument that isn't compatible with utilitarianism. Most of the time you can get away with it. Why do I say that? Well, some people would say it's because all judges are utilitarians, or most judges are utilitarians. And I think that there is some truth to that. But there are 3 other reasons that I think are important as to why it's rarely a good idea to break out of the utilitarian paradigm and just go whole hog. The reasons for that are as follows. The first of those reasons is that it's oftentimes not necessary to investigate the ethical underpinnings of both sides in a debate. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, virtually all ethical systems agree on most moral questions. Very few ethical systems would say that, for example, it's a bad thing to assist someone who's poor or needy, and most ethical systems equally condemn arbitrary violence. Now, the result of that is that you can resolve a number of different debates and debate questions without picking apart the distinctions between ethical systems. So, those of you who are familiar with terms like utilitarianism will probably be familiar with various thought experiments designed to judge how far utilitarianism jives with our existing moral intuitions. You may have realized that a number of those moral intuitions and thought experiments involve various groups of people being tied to sections of railroad and trolleys being hurled toward them at high speed, and then somebody operating a switch that can either divert the train onto it or trolley onto a siding, or have it continue on top of a smaller group of people. As you may have already recognized, those situations don't appear terribly frequently in real life. That's because most of the ethically good and ethically bad actions we interact with will be ethically good or ethically bad, more or less regardless of the ethical system that we're using. Now, debating oftentimes involves very difficult issues, but they're not always difficult in a meta-ethical sense. So you no more have to resolve which school of ethics you really belong to in many debates than you do whether to need to resolve whether or not materialism or dualism provides a better account of the existence of everything. So that's one of the reasons you don't necessarily need to challenge utilitarianism, is that actually most of the time it isn't a necessary investigation. It's not going to be a battleground in the debate. And that's not necessarily because everyone is taking utilitarian assumptions for granted. It's that an investigation of the ethical underpinnings of what you're doing isn't necessary. So if you're, for example, having a debate about privatizing schools, in theory, that could take you along the lines of having to choose between competing moral systems in their meta-ethical claims, but it might not. And if it doesn't, that's not a problem. The second reason, I think, is that it can often lead you into difficulty. There are many times you may be in a situation where you feel obliged to give an argument which is contrary to utilitarianism or contrary to utilitarian thinking, when ultimately you could have fought the battle much more effectively in non-utilitarian language. What do I mean by that? Well, take, for example, the debate, this House believes that children who are not vaccinated should not be allowed to attend state schools. Most debaters would probably say that was pretty proposition heavy, and the proposition probably had the better of the argument because vaccines are pretty good. I think many debaters would look at that debate, look at the opposition, and then say, well, actually, I suppose I have to make some sort of argument about how, regardless of how good it is for the children to be vaccinated, the parents nevertheless have the right not to have their children vaccinated, because that's just an extension of parents' rights, and parents' rights are more important, and forget about any utilitarian or consequential considerations on the part of the child. I think that's a very difficult argument to run. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I certainly couldn't win with it if I was in opposition. And if you feel obliged to have a metaphysical discussion about meta-ethics and to challenge utilitarianism as a framework, I think you will find yourself fighting an uphill battle in those particular circumstances. So as a result, I think it can distract you from those points which might be slightly more profitable. So in the debate I've just outlined, in the motion regarding sort of parents, children, vaccination in schools, I think there's a far more fruitful line of argumentation that goes along the lines of saying, well, if we imagine a group of parents and a group of families that are so estranged from mainstream thinking that they genuinely feel that they're doing best by their children by not vaccinating them, and then we push all of their children outside of mainstream education, possibly to private education, possibly to homeschooling groups, we create two things. The first of which is a group of children all sharing their germs with each other, none of whom have been vaccinated. The other thing we create is a group of children who, probably speaking, given that anti-vaccination campaigns are correlative with other forms of anti-state or potentially even paranoid thinking, are all talking to each other and not associating with mainstream viewpoints. And that's likely to further estrange the relations between the second generation and the state. And I think, personally, I think that's actually a far more viable strategy for debating and challenging the proposition on that motion. But if you start you listen to the motion and you think to yourself, this is one of those amazing set-piece battles between utilitarianism and non-utilitarian thinking, I think it'll actually take a less profitable course of action. The third reason I think that utilitarianism is often better not challenged is that it is a very easy to access ethical code for those who are judging British parliamentary debates. I think to some extent, the extent to which you adopt an ethical system is the extent to which it can explain what you're doing. If you are a British parliamentary debating judge, what you ideally want to do is to deliver feedback and deliver adjudications in which you weigh the comparative merits of each team. So, for example, there will rarely be a debate where, say, for example, the topic is euthanasia, and where the judge at the end of the debate says, all right, that was a very interesting debate. However, a second opposition in this debate about euthanasia proved to me that that God exists, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that the Pope is the representative of Jesus Christ on earth, and that ethics means obeying the Catholic Church, has pointed me to the relevant encyclicals describing why euthanasia is condemned, and therefore wins the debate. It's irrelevant what the rest of you said. Thanks very much. Bye. Now, despite the fact that that way of thinking does inform a number of people's views worldwide on the permissibility of euthanasia, it's not a very attractive way to most judges in a formal British parliamentary debate for how they would compare arguments and weigh debates. What they really want to do is they really want to move between the different teams and say, your contribution was this, your contribution was that, I compared this contribution to that contribution. The result is that they can do a weighing exercise, which I don't say is incompatible with other ethical philosophies, but lends itself more easily to utilitarian premises and assumptions. As a result, and apologies for those who can't see it properly, my first strategy for breaking the utilitarian bubble is don't. So that's strategy number one. And as I've said before, for those of you just tuning in, the strategies on the left-hand side, that is to say this side in black and red, will be strategies that don't really break the utilitarian bubble, but may purport to do so. The second of these 8 reasons, use of stapler, and apologies, I don't know how many of you will actually be able to read this, as it will probably be back to front, is to expand the concept of utility. It's not really a way of breaking the utilitarian paradigm, but it may purport to do so. So you're in a debate where one side is saying, look, we should do X or Y action as a result of its utility. There will be times you can make what appear to be non-utilitarian arguments that are actually nevertheless utilitarian in their very nature. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say, for example, that you are a judge and you're faced with a landlord and a tenant hasn't paid their rent, but asks to be able to stay in the landlord's property anyway. Nevertheless, and the law is very clear on the point, that if a tenant is overstaying their welcome and hasn't paid their rent, they need to be evicted and the landlord is entitled to possession of the property. Now, on a utilitarian basis, you might say that the utilitarian answer is that the tenant should be allowed to stay, because if the tenant is made homeless, that will affect them very dramatically. And how much will it affect the landlord? Well, they'll get less rent, but it probably won't be the end of the world for them. So on the balance of costs and benefits, utilitarianism would seem to dictate that the judge should rule summarily in favour of the tenant rather than the landlord. What I mean to say when I say that my second strategy is to expand the concept of utility, I should more say it's to expand the investigation of utility. In part because in a case like that, especially, it's a very clear-cut case, you will have to take into account the manner in which, as the judge, that you are cheapening adherence to the legal order and ruining people's faith in it if you simply ignore the law and start ruling in favour of those who have sympathetic cases, even if doing so would appear to produce more utility in the short run than in the long run. Now, that isn't, as I've said before, the bits that are on the left-hand side are not themselves real challenges to utilitarianism. That isn't a challenge to utilitarianism. It's simply a wider investigation of what it really is. Because if people lose respect for the civil legal order, well, at a minimum, there's going to be fewer landlords, you could argue, who are going to be renting out their homes to tenants if they don't feel that they can enforce their rights if the tenant defaults on the obligation to pay rent. More dramatically, you could say what happens when people lose faith in the legal order altogether. My point is to say that sometimes that will mean there will be times when in debates you're faced with a situation where you have very strong arguments for saying that what would appear to be the non-utilitarian argument ought to be favoured and followed. But that's not necessarily because you've actually challenged utilitarian biases. It's actually because what you've done is you've expanded the concept of utility a bit further. So there's some other ways you can do that I think are quite neat tricks, particularly when you're trying to argue in favour of autonomy, rights, etc. It's often said by liberal or libertarian philosophers, for example, that people don't like being dictated to, that they like being able to exercise autonomy over their own lives, and they like to be able to see the fruits of their own decisions being made manifest in the decisions they take and the consequences that follow. In other words, they like the feeling of liberty. Now, technically speaking, the utilitarian can claim that for themselves as well and say, all right, we will take into account when performing the utilitarian calculus people's feelings and enjoyment of liberty. We will take into account the fact they don't like being dictated to. That doesn't mean we agree with any of this airy-fairy notion regarding universal rights that exist in the ether somewhere. It's merely that we respect that there's a need for some recognition of the extent to which utility accrues to individuals in that situation. So it's still a utilitarian argument, but it certainly sounds, walks and quacks like a non-utilitarian one. So that's my second reason, is that for breaking the utilitarian paradigm, is that you can expand your investigation for utility, and in some cases, you can look to an expanded definition of what utility constitutes and look for places where you didn't expect to see it. As you can see, there's a few of you now watching. Please do log in with some comments, and I will address them as I go through. The fact that there are 8 strategies means that there are some fairly obvious stopping points for me. So those are my first 2 strategies down. The third of the 3 strategies, and apologies, I didn't realise, being as technophobe that I am, that this would come out backwards. But the third of the 8 strategies is related to the second, and it is to adhere to rule utilitarianism. Now, rule utilitarianism is a version or a variant of utilitarianism, which says that you don't do the action which creates the greatest amount of happiness and which creates the least amount of suffering, but nevertheless you adhere to the rule which creates the greatest good as measured by greatest happiness and least amount of suffering. That's very consistent with the second rule, with the second strategy I just outlined of expanding your calculus. It is slightly different though. So, for example, if you are a judge in the situation faced with, I spoke about earlier, where you've got a tenant and you've got a landlord, and you're faced with that difficult decision as to whether or not you rule summarily in favour of the tenant or the landlord, a judge adopting the second strategy might say, well, I have to take into account how much the tenant is going to suffer, but equally I have to take into account the extent to which there will be a discrediting of legal processes and people will lose their faith in the justice system altogether. A rule utilitarian would view things slightly differently. What they would say is, you don't simply look at the 2 items and weigh them up. You determine in advance what the correct ethical rule is to follow, and then you obey it. What makes a rule utilitarian different, of course, is that the manner in which they determine what a good rule is its propensity to create utility. So how can you use that in debating? Well, to some extent, that question is answered by looking at the addressee of the motion. So a motion that says something to the effect of, as I think happened in the World's Final a couple of years ago, that the poor of the world have a right to rise up in a Marxist revolution if they so choose, is not concerned per se with the consequences of doing so, or at least arguably per se is not a concern with that. It's concerned with a pre-existing. It's concerned with a pre-existing question, namely the question of whether or not the normal rules against prohibition and against violent insurrection ought to be rushed aside, and the poor ought to be left to obey that for themselves. One of the reasons that rule utilitarians can sometimes get an advantage over hedonistic act utilitarians, who say just look at the act and do whatever creates the greatest happiness, is that rule utilitarians can provide people and communities with bright lines. It may well be that there are cases where, in the desire and the quest to create greater utility, we actually create less of it. So, for example, a strict hedonistic act utilitarian might say that we are obliged to take unpopular people off the streets and kill them and harvest their organs to save more people's lives. That would appear to create more utility. It's not a great world to live in, though, and we're all going to be a bit unhappy when the result of that is that we're afraid to go outside and walk the dog because, never know, your organs might be harvested if you're deemed insufficiently popular. And the second strategy that I've outlined of expanding our utilitarian investigation can to some extent cater for that. I think what a rule utilitarian would say, though, in some instances is, well, actually, what we need is self-binding ordinances. We can't trust ourselves in the heat of the moment always to consider all of the possible ramifications of our actions and then pick the one that's most felicitous in terms of utilitarian consequences. What we rather ought to do is we need to have some set rules ahead of time that we all obey. We design those rules with utility in mind, but then, once those rules are set, we obey them regardless of the utility that they tend to promote. So if we go through life thinking every human being is inviolable, I can never murder someone, there might be opportunities to create greater utility, i.e. killing someone who's just walking around on the street to harvest their organs to save loads more people. We may pass up those opportunities, and we may, in those few circumstances, create greater utility, but having a bright line ethically to say we will not murder other people, rather than murder other people or do whatever you need to do if it's going to create greater utility, may lead to a situation in which A, we're all scared for our lives, and B, we make poor judgments in the heat of the moment regarding ethical consequences. So as a result, there may be cases where in debates you will wish to argue that whilst this action or this decision may not seem to produce utility, actually it's doing so pursuant to the furtherance of a rule, and obedience to that rule is actually likely to create greater utility in the long run. So that's the third strategy. The fourth strategy that I outlined, and the final one on the left-hand side, that is to say the side that has are not real strategies for breaking the utilitarian paradigm, but are largely within it, is that you can win a concession. And if you win a concession, the hard work is done for you. Now, that's not necessary, that doesn't require any of the non-utilitarian arguments of the sort that we'll see on the right-hand side to actually have been promoted by you. It simply requires you to pivot off of a concession the other side have made. Let me give you an example. I was once in a debate about assisted dying and euthanasia, and the team in proposition stood up, and they were very clever. They spent the first 2 or 3 minutes of their speech saying there's going to be all of these exceptions to euthanasia under our model. There's going to be, you can only access it if you have about 8 seconds to live. There's going to be 100 bazillion doctors who are going to have to sign off on it. It's got to be completely incurable and absolutely no hope of recovery, and you have to be suffering absolutely unbearable pain. And they kept labeling on more and more exceptions. But then they began their speeches by saying, well, actually, the reason we favour this program of euthanasia and assisted dying is that people have a right to die. They have this ability to kill themselves and to enlist the help of those who wish to volunteer to assist them in doing so. And we justify that on utilitarian grounds because it will save the world from a lot of pain. So I was going to ask them in a point of information. I would say, well, if this right does exist, and there is this universal right that you assert for individuals to choose to end their own life, why have you spent the first 3 minutes of your speech hemming in that right with exceptions and qualifications? Because what I was able to do, therefore, in my speech was to say they themselves accept that this principle can only go too far. So once you've created a class of, or the other side, I should say, has created a class of things that are outside normal utilitarian parameters, all you have to do on the other side is to attach the subject matter of this particular debate to that exceptional class. Let me give you a more concrete example. I was once judging a debate in which proposition was Sydney A and Oxford A, and there were two teams in opposition on a motion, something to the effect of this House would institute the death penalty as the penalty for first-degree murder if it could be found to have a substantial deterrent effect. Now, the proposition teams were all world's finalists and world semi-finalists, and they were very excellent. And one of the speakers in proposition stood up and said, well, you know, this is a perfectly sensible utilitarian model. There's a certain amount of death to go around, and if we institute the death penalty, we will save people's lives through the deterrent effect as the motion presupposes, and therefore we ought to do it. But he got an interesting point of information from the opposition, which was, well, you've said all that. Would you be happy in circumstances where innocent people were being put on show trials and then subject to the death penalty in order to create the same or substantially similar deterrent effect? And what the speaker was forced to choose. He could either say yes, which seems deeply immoral, or he could say no. In which case, which he did, he said, well, no, obviously it's only for those who are guilty. But what he'd done there was to establish a class of things, a class of rights that were not subject to utilitarianism. Because if his utilitarian principles were correct, he would equally have to say that innocent people should be obliged to be willing to sacrifice their own lives and be subject to the death penalty if it does in fact create that greater deterrence. And so what you have to do then in opposition, having won that concession in the point of information, is to say, proposition themselves accept there is a set of things and a set of cases that are simply out of bounds. There are some rights that are simply not subject to utilitarian demands. One of those is the right to life. They accept it in the case of the innocent. We say it's universal. And what we're going to prove today is that the very considerations that make the innocent man's life inviolable, which they recognize, are the same considerations that apply to a guilty man as well. And once you've done that, once you've framed it that way, you probably take at least second place. But once you've done that, I think you can more easily pick apart a utilitarian conception when the other side have done it for you. So that's my fourth strategy. The four strategies that are on the right-hand side are themselves real strategies that do actually, to one extent or another, amount to a rebuke to utilitarianism. They in some way will challenge it or seek to limit it. By all means, do put in your questions as well. Otherwise, I'm simply on transmit for another 20 minutes or so. The fifth of my exciting strategies is to question the extent to which, as utilitarianism demands, trade-offs are possible between persons. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you're a utilitarian, what you would say is that what we do when we're weighing the goodness or the badness of an action is we weigh up the extent to which it causes one person pain, one person pleasure, one person pain, one person pleasure. We add and subtract it all together and we get basically an aggregate score. And if that score is positive, the action is good. And if that score is higher than the score that we would have got from any competing action, it's the best possible thing that we can do. One of the ways in which you can have a go at that sort of analysis is to say that, well, actually, that is simply not possible. And utilitarianism is fundamentally incorrect in that it presupposes that that exercise can happen, that those trade-offs are even possible. What do I mean by that? Well, this is quite a complicated and philosophically rather dense argument, and it's a difficult one to deploy. What those who would criticize utilitarianism on these grounds would say is that the distinctiveness of persons means that no utilitarian trade-offs of the sort I've described are possible. So let me give you a counterexample. Suppose that I am suffering from some sort of malady, and the only way to save my life is to amputate my leg. Well, on utilitarian grounds, that's easily justified. I have some suffering because of my leg being chopped off, but that's outweighed by avoiding even greater suffering and dying and the happiness that I will presumably have throughout the rest of my life. In that case, I, Doug, experience both the pleasure and the pain that accrue to each action. When you're dealing with different people in society, there is no social organism that feeds off the pleasure and the pain of both and then arrives at some sort of aggregate score. There are only individuals and their unique subjective experiences which can't be traded off against each other. To put it another way, in the classic example, classic thought experiment, in which one innocent person is being tortured to buy bliss and happiness for the rest of society, for the individual who is being tortured, life is terrible and unbearable. And it is equally unbearable whether or not they are creating utopia for the rest of the world or not. And there is nothing in their life which is compensated for by the happiness of others. They're only completely separate worlds of experience, and there's no common feeling between them. There's no way they can be simply mushed together and aggregated. There's a chap who used to debate, I think is now actually back on the circuit, named Sam Bloch, who would often deploy this argument to very great effect. Now that's a very clever argument, I think, for having a poke at a lot of utilitarian assumptions. One of the difficulties with it is that it is limited in how far it takes you, because even if you were able to demonstrate that it's true, it doesn't actually prove to you that you should take the non-utilitarian course of action. It merely suggests, if you leave it at its bare assumptions, that you should be indifferent between persons, i.e., if taken to its logical conclusion, the argument would say that if you are faced with a course of action where you can flip a switch, and 5 people can die from a trolley, or 10 people can die from a trolley, or whatever, you should be indifferent. Because they each have their own completely unique world of experience and feeling, and there's nothing to choose between them. There's things to choose within them, but not between them. So that simply leads, you can say without something more, into ethical paralysis. To take that one step further and to actually do something with that argument, you will usually have to make a further assumption. That assumption may well be that because you cannot make such decisions and determinations, the thing that you have to be concerned about is your own ethical purity and your own good decision making. So in the case in which you are presented with the choice of killing one person to harvest their organs to save 5 different people, given that there is no way of choosing between the 1 and the 5, the thing that you ought to be concerned with is the actions that you create in the world rather than the circumstances that otherwise result. Personally, I find this argument rather unconvincing. Taken to its logical extreme, someone who believes in the uniqueness of persons to the extent to which, torturing one person to buy bliss for the rest of the world for everyone would be impermissible, or at least a matter of indifference, could not even spit on one person, really, to save the rest of the world from torture, because the minor lack of utility that one person experiences has nothing to outweigh it, even in the bliss that's purchased for the rest of the world. Now, I find that just intuitively unsatisfactory, and you'll note that in the examples that are often given, the non-utilitarians will often talk about torture or murder as the actions which can't ever be justified because of the uniqueness of the person. But if the uniqueness of the person was the critical factor, then even lesser infringements upon their happiness could not be outweighed by enormous benefits to the rest of society. So that's one way in which you can have a go at it. All right, so that's number 5. Still don't have any questions on the live chat, maybe because no one's actually watching. But please do send those in as they occur. Without any further ado, then I will move on to number 6. So number 5, we explored whether or not such trade-offs were possible. And now, number 6, my 6th reason, is going to be to explore whether or not the relevant trade-offs are permissible. It goes without saying that when I've done this lesson in the past, I've done it with the benefit of either a whiteboard or a chalkboard, so I haven't had to resort to this sort of nonsense. So the strategy at number 5 suggested that we could question whether or not it was possible to even trade off utility amongst people. Strategy number 6 is going to go one step further and say, is it permissible? So even if that sort of trading off between individuals of utility that we talked about could happen, is it ethically okay? I think that this is one of these arguments where it is easier to pump an intuition than to prove the point. I think it is very attractive to say that the individuals are all possessed with rights that are inviolable no matter how much utility would be gained from the violation of those rights. Now, as we explored on the left-hand side, the ways of breaking the utilitarian paradigm that aren't actually ways of breaking it, we learned that there could be conceptions of rights that utilitarians could even defend. They could, for example, be rule utilitarians, or they could say that the establishment of rights ultimately leads to greater utility anyway, so we should have lots of rights as long as we judge them first on the basis of utility. But there are some people who would go further with what rights entail, and they would say that those legitimate claims that we have and that we call rights aren't simply a factor of their utility, but they arise from somewhere else, be it creation by God and being endowed with particular dignity as a result, be it our very humanness, be it social community, etc. But that in any event, we have some realms of our experience that are simply out of bounds for utilitarian and consequentialist thinking. As I say, I think that is rather more easily asserted than it is demonstrated. As before, on the left-hand side, if you win a concession to that effect, you may find that your life is made a good deal more easy. I'm running out of battery, so I'm going to need to move to plug my laptop in, but I'll talk as I go. You'll find that, as I say, a good deal more easy if you to assert than to prove. So how do you do it? There's a couple of interesting tricks that I think are quite useful here. One of which, and I've seen deployed to great effect by one or two debaters in my time, is that you can say that it is simply to pump that intuition by way of examples. So if I want, I want to even do something quite minor, like I want to play tennis with you and you don't want to play tennis with me, one would say that normally speaking that we would not then go to a question of utility to determine whether or not there's going to be a match. I'm simply out of luck because you have the right simply to say no. And there would be more easily demonstrable suggestions to that effect concerning, for example, the individual's choice of religion, their bodily autonomy, etc. To the extent to which we wouldn't say, well, would it be more utilitarian for the benefit of the world if we could frog march everyone to church every Sunday morning? We simply wouldn't undertake that exercise. And I think that simply asserting that and saying that to most judges will be very attractive, and most teams will not call you up on it. What happens when they do? What happens when they say, well, hang on, where do these rights derive from? I think, begging your pardon, I'm going to just get my laptop charger plugged back in. What happens when they do? What happens when you get called on it? One tactic I've seen used a couple of times to very great effect goes something like this. That the intuition tore in favor of, say, bodily autonomy, in favor of some realm of rights which isn't subject to utilitarian calculuses, is as much a base ethical intuition as anything else we might say or assert. So even the intuition that we ought to pursue higher utility consequences as opposed to lower utility ones has to at some point stem from an intuition. And that intuition, I think we can safely assert, is as basic or nearly as basic to us as the intuition which says that all of us have certain inviolable rights. And there's no reason to say that, well, we should dismiss the notion of, say, bodily autonomy, the right to religious freedom, etc., as simply an intuition or something that we need to reason our way out of, when utilitarians ultimately have to fall back on intuitions as well in order to prove their point. I've seen that run very successfully before. There are other different conceptual tools you can use, one of which I found reasonably attractive and has sometimes steered debaters through choppy waters, begging pardon. Is to assert that there are some rights that we gain by dint of social community, and there are some rights that we gain because we are simply human. And that one test for that is to see whether or not we have those rights in the pre-social state of nature, whether we have those rights by dint of being human, whether or not they are an outgrowth of that. So, for example, you can say, well, my right not to be tortured isn't something I gain as from social community. It's something that I have by dint of my body and my humanness, and I have that long before any society would have been formed. What I don't have is various social rights, voting rights, political rights, etc. Those only come by way of social community. They only come because of the rest of society helping me out. And as a result, those might be susceptible to utilitarian calculuses in a way that my normal human rights are not. That's a very attractive and beguiling formulation in some cases. I think it definitely has its limitations. So it would suggest, for example, if you try and use it as I wanted in a parents' rights debate, that there was nothing that parents couldn't do to their children because children were simply an outgrowth of normal, natural state of nature-based rights. Whereas, and as a result that they were, they were somehow simply their parents' property to do with as they liked. Well, there are clearly some limits, and those limits have to be dictated by society, even though the rearing of children, the raising of children, isn't simply one effect of the creation of society, and isn't really possible about the creation of human society. So I think that argument certainly has its limits, but I think it can be an attractive formulation as well. So that is my sixth argument. I will bring up my seventh now. Begging your pardon. So the seventh argument is to ask whether or not the trade-offs that we've spoken about that are necessary for utilitarianism to prosper are aggregable. So by aggregable, what I mean is to say that what you do is that you add up all the costs and benefits to each person, smoosh them all together into one pot, and then you're left with one great big number at the end, and you decide whether or not that ultimate effect is positive or negative, and then are able to gauge the goodness and badness of the action. And we've looked at two critiques of that already, whether or not those trade-offs are possible between persons, and whether or not they are permissible between persons. There is a further question, I think, about aggregability. And this is, of the 8 reasons I'm about to describe, this may be the one you use least. And what it does is it says, all right, utilitarians, you've got something going for you. It might well be that we can talk about trading off utility between persons. There might be cases, at least, where there are no relevant rights involved. But there's something about the way in which you've quantified how it all works that we find quite repugnant. Let me give you some examples of ways in which you can use this tool to your effect. If you are a strict utilitarian, there must be, it would seem, an amount of people in the universe who, by being afforded a small positive pleasure, say like having the taste of chocolate, could justify a person being tortured. And then what you might say, the utilitarian might say, well, no, it doesn't work like that. One person being tortured is obviously a massive drain on utility, and chocolate itself could never outweigh that. But I think if you're a strict utilitarian, you would have to say that there is a number. If what we are doing is looking to an aggregation of preferences, it might be billions of people having to eat chocolate. But there seems something quite, I think, intuitively wrong about that. That's how things work. So you might say that actually that the correct answer is to say that there are some pains and pleasures that aren't compensatable by other gains. And I actually think torture is probably the best example of where you might be able to deploy that, to say that one person's suffering in torture might create such pain and such suffering that moderate gains to, say, security, even for millions of people, could never possibly outweigh that, even if millions of people are saved from a violent death. Now, that doesn't prevent us from torturing one person to save 10 people from torture, but it suggests that utilitarians might not necessarily have everything right. I don't think that's a particularly profound critique of utilitarianism, and I'll tell you why. The reason is that utilitarianism is itself an artificial aggregation exercise. It is, to me, an added layer of artificiality to say that we should then put different types of pain and suffering into tiers or categories. This is at best, I think, a critique of utilitarianism. There are some people, for example, who would say that, who are near utilitarians, who call themselves prioritarians, who will say that ethical actions are those that produce the greatest amount of utility, but that utility is bounded by a need to create utility and a special priority for giving utility to those who do not have it already. So saving one person from torture will easily out-justify gains for utility for lots of other people. That sort of position is something of a halfway house between those who say there can be no trade-offs between persons and those who say we just go whole hog utilitarianism, aggregate it all up. One intuition that can help you, you can pump with that, one example you can use is used by Robert Nozick, which is called the utility monster, which will be familiar to a number of you. Robert Nozick hypothesized, when he was criticizing utilitarianism, that if utilitarianism in its strictest sense were true, we would have to say that we could envisage, even hypothetically, a person who gained so much utility from, say, torturing other people or from enslaving them or whatever, that their happiness just went up by such an extent that that was justified. But that seems intuitively wrong, that utilitarianism could demand circumstances where slavery was permissible or murder was permissible, provided that the happiness that accrued to those individuals who benefited from it was sufficiently high. So that's one way in which you can sort of take a couple of, you can take a poke at utilitarianism, but not one I think can be used very frequently in debating. Certainly wasn't one that I did as well. Okay, the 8th and the final method of breaking the utilitarian paradigm is I think in some ways one of the most powerful of the 8, which is to question the extent to which happiness, as measured by increases in pleasure and decreases in pain, is actually really the measure of ethics at all. It's not really something the earlier critiques have questioned. They've more talked about the distribution of happiness rather than whether or not it itself is the end goal in any event. And I think one way of looking at that, one sort of way you can work on that intuition, is to say that on a utilitarian basis, there would seem to be no sensible argument you could possibly give against hooking yourself up to an experience machine which would simulate a wholesome, happy, and meaningful life by placing you in some sort of dream state, rendering you unconscious for the rest of your life, in which you would feel as though you were living a wonderful and great life, even though you were just hooked up to a machine in a hospital somewhere. And I think intuitively, for most of us, that does seem quite unsatisfying. It doesn't seem as though we have lived a good life, even if the result is that we're kept very happy. And I think that is one way of saying that individuals want something more out of their lives than simply temporal happiness, and even long-term happiness. They want to feel that they've lived meaningfully and richly. Now, utilitarians, as you'll have gathered from the manner in which we've dealt with the other critiques, are often very keen to grab onto the good points of other ethical doctrines and to say, our concept of utility is quite wide and broad. We can take that into account. So we can take into account the desire to live meaningfully and the desire to, feel like you've lived a good life, as opposed to merely a satisfying one, as opposed to merely a happy one. But that still doesn't get rid of the paradox of the experience machine, because presumably there could be a machine that could simulate having a good and rich and meaningful life, even if it wasn't actually happening. Where does that come into debating? The answer is fairly rarely. There will be a couple of occasions though, and I think it comes up with things like, for example, having children, etc., where individuals may even report decreases in happiness, but increases in fulfillment. And that sort of fulfillment, you can argue, is what we are really after as human beings, that goes beyond happiness itself. And I think what you can say is the fact that utilitarians, oftentimes when they're at their weakest, is when they're pressed for a reason for action, when they're asked why utility. And the answer that they give, and certainly the classic utilitarians often gave, was that's what's really lying at the base of all of our ethical intuitions and all the other ethical systems anyway, is a desire to create pleasure and to decrease pain. All we're doing is codifying it and calling it out for what it is. That's what all moral rules are about. But I'm not entirely sure that's true. And you may be able to take a poke at that being true. You may be able to say, given that utilitarians have to say that this is what we're after anyway, all we have to do is to prove that isn't what humans are after anyway. They do want something different. The fact that we all reject intuitively the experience machine as being a bit of a bad choice is itself proof that utilitarianism is wrong, because if utilitarian can only justify itself as being at the base of all of our intuitions, we can prove that it isn't at the base of all of our intuitions. We aren't simply pursuing happiness. And even when offered happiness on a plate, human beings often reject it in favor of something more. That something more then can be whatever it is you find important in the particular debate. The only other way in which I would put under this about sort of questioning happiness is that maybe in instances where you want to question whether or not the happiness that has accrued to some individuals is worth counting. So most of us would say that the wrongness of slavery isn't measured by the harm to the slave is against the benefit to the slave owner, but the benefit to the slave owner should in some way be discounted altogether. That individual's happiness, that the enjoyment they feel at seeing someone else enslaved, or the enjoyment that some people might feel at seeing, torture or experiencing some sort of other suffering or inflicting suffering on others, should in some way be discounted altogether, because we've got something deeper than happiness, be that fulfillment, be that virtue, etc. And that the cultivation of that is really what's underlying our ethical intuitions. And as I say, I think you can get quite a lot of mileage simply by asserting those claims and then using one or two examples to jive the intuitions, and then see where it goes from there. As I said from the start though, 9 times out of 10, you don't need to break the utilitarian box at all. There being no questions or comments on the live chat feed, I would just conclude by saying a couple of remarks. I started at the very beginning by saying you normally we're not going to want to launch an anti-utilitarian or critical of utilitarian challenge. But actually, there is one exception to that rule, one time where I think it will be often beneficial for you, and that is finals, particularly public finals. The reason for that is this. In the final, of course, you're playing for broke. In most other rounds, getting a second or a third is considerably better than getting a fourth, whereas in a final, you're going for first or broke. Second, there's no prizes usually for second place. So as a result, creating your own daring and exciting take on the debate that appears to go against what we'd normally expect will yield increased dividends for you. The other reason, of course, is that, and it's one thing I often give advice to, one bit of advice I often give to debaters regarding public finals is to remember they are public spectacles. They're being put on by those who are judging them, and those who are judging and organising tournaments have a desire to have those tournaments go well. And it's usually them and their immediate friends who are judging the final. So if you can create a debate that seems worthy of a final, you will often do very well over and above the technical debating merits. And delving into the particular subtleties and nuances of utilitarianism, and indeed critiquing it on some occasion, may be exactly what the doctor ordered in terms of producing memorable speeches that people feel are worthy of the final and lend it that extra bit of respectability. So when I've tended to go for grand sweeping metaphysical claims, it tended to be when the stakes are higher, and when coming in first and doing your own unique and off-the-wall thing will yield increased dividends. 9 times out of 10, I play it safe, and I stay within the utilitarian bubble. But hopefully, from this lesson, you've had a chance to look at some strategies for how to get out of it, or at least play better while you're inside it. That, I think, is all from me. I'm just going to look to see if there's any questions. There's no questions in the live chat. I think that's largely due, I'll flatter myself, to the fact that we were extremely late in starting, which was entirely my fault due to my lack of technical proficiency. If you've got any questions on any of the things that I've shared here, feel free to add me on Facebook and pop me a message. We're happy to discuss this stuff much further. Happy debating. Cheers. Bye-bye.